Host here at Fordham, and I'd like to extend to everyone on this Zoom call a warm welcome to the 2021-22 Fordham Distinguished Lecture on Disability. Let me start with an access note. This event has live captions. To access the captions, click on live transcripts and then show subtitles. This event is sponsored by the Conference of Arts and Science Deans and the Office of Research. And this is the 6th Fordham Distinguished Lecture on Disability. The series is organized by the Disability Studies Program and the Research Consortium on Disability. The Disability Studies Program examines historical, cultural, economic, physiological, and socio-political perspectives to unpack the meanings and effects of disability. It was launched in spring 2019 to provide students with a background in the ways the concepts of disability and normality are understood in different times, spaces, and cultures, and to provide them with a practical knowledge of how to conceptualize and produce more accessible built and social environments. The minor offers students an interdisciplinary way to engage with questions about the meanings and experiences of disability through coursework, on-campus events, and participation in the broader disability studies community in New York City. The Research Consortium on Disability, RCD, coordinates and supports disability-related research at Fordham University to help guide the world on a path towards inclusion. The people in the consortium are social scientists and scholars in the humanities, in business, education, law, and social services, doing research in disability studies and in disability and health-related fields. Its next major event is an online symposium on spirituality on April 8th and 9th. For further information or to register, there's a link in the chat box. Turning to today's event, it will take place in 2 parts, a lecture followed by a Q&A with the audience through the Q&A chat box. I want to mention that this talk is being recorded and will be available on the consortium YouTube channel soon, but the Q&A will not be recorded. The Q&A will be moderated by Sarah Macy and Professor Mickey McGee. Sarah Macy is a graduating senior at FCLC, majoring in psychology and minoring in disability studies. She is passionate about disability and neurodiversity advocacy. As an autistic woman who works with adults who have intellectual developmental disabilities, Sarah views disability from a unique perspective. Today, she is very excited to help moderate our discussion with Dr. Grinker. Dr. Mickey McGee is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Fordham. Her research interests are wide-ranging, with major projects focused on the American preoccupation with makeover culture, artists' communities in the making of the American empire, and the emergence of autism and neurodiversity as identity markers in the late 20th century. Her first book, Self-Help, Inc., Makeover Culture in American Life, Oxford University Press, 2005, examines America's burgeoning culture of self-improvement and has been widely reviewed and discussed in national and international publications. Self-Help, Inc. was translated in Korean as The Trap of Self-Development and has led to an abiding fascination with Korean culture, particularly K-pop and Korean televisual melodramas. Her edited volume, Yado, Making American Culture, considered an artists' community in Saratoga Springs, New York, that was instrumental in shaping important threads of 20th century American literature, music, and visual art. That volume accompanied an exhibition by the same name at the New York Public Library. In her personal life, she is the delighted parent of a neurologically divergent young adult and has spent 21 years navigating the diagnostic landscapes that her family first encountered in 2001. She's at work on a multifaceted project about that experience and is thrilled to serve as the co-moderator for today's question and answer with Dr. Grinker, whose 2008 book, Unstrange Minds, shaped both her thinking and her family's life. Now, let me introduce our distinguished speaker. We are very excited to have Roy Richard Grinker with us today. Roy Richard Grinker, PhD, is professor of anthropology at George Washington University and editor-in-chief of Anthropological Quarterly. Dr. Grinker was born and raised in Chicago, where his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather practiced psychoanalysis. He received his BA in anthropology at Grinnell College in 1983, his MA in social anthropology at Harvard University in 1985, and his PhD in social anthropology in 1989. Dr. Grinker has conducted research on hunter-gatherers in Central Africa, North Korean defectors in South Korea, and epidemiology of autism. In 2008, his book, Unstrange Minds, Remapping the World of Autism, was the recipient of the National Alliance on Mental Illness Ken Award for outstanding contribution to the understanding of mental illness. Unstrange Minds was inspired by his daughter, Isabel, who was diagnosed with autism in 1994. The book documents Grinker's global quest to discover the surprising truth about why autism is so much more common today. In the process, he made some controversial discoveries about autism. Building on Unstrange Minds and based on research in Africa, Asia, and the US, his new book, Nobody's Normal, tells the uplifting story of how we are successfully challenging the stigma that has long shadowed mental illnesses. Please join me in welcoming Professor Grinker to Fordham.
Thank you, Professor Crystal, Professor Mitra, Professor McGee, Sarah, Macy. Thank you so much for having me. I was honored to be invited, and it's a pleasure to speak to all of you. As Dr. Crystal noted, my family has been steeped within the history of psychiatry. And while in my other books and articles, I've focused more on ethnographic contexts, I began Nobody's Normal with my own family. As Dr. Crystal noted, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, my father were psychiatrists. My wife is also a psychiatrist at the National Institutes of Health. And I grew up across the street from my grandfather, which is an unusual thing for people these days. But it was an amazing education that I had with him. He spoke to me like I was an adult. Even at 10, 11, 12 years old, he was giving me little mini seminars on Saturday afternoons about things like the differential diagnosis of people with personality disorders or the emerging epidemiology of mental illnesses. Despite living in very different times, all of my family, whether it was my grandfather or the writings of my great-grandfather, who I never met, my father, my wife, all taught me the same thing, that mental illnesses are a double illness. There's first the ailment itself, and secondly, society's negative judgment. Nobody's Normal, though, as Dr. Crystal actually mentioned, is supposed to be an uplifting book. There are many, many books out there about what's wrong with our healthcare system, what's wrong with stigma, what's wrong with mental health care, what obstacles there are. This book talks about something else. It talks about some of the things that are going well, particularly as the result of advocacy and self-advocacy. The book is really about how we are starting to eliminate the shame and the secrecy that has shadowed mental illnesses and also served as an obstacle to the support and care of sufferers for way too long. Indeed, one of the most remarkable stories, I think, of the last 2 decades is the transformation of many illnesses and disabilities away from being shameful and frightening into ones that are increasingly understood as part of what it means to be human. We can consider autism, once a narrowly defined condition that was a devastating diagnosis, but which now isn't always devastating and certainly encompasses an enormous range of variation that includes great suffering, but also includes great strengths and great skills. And we are redefining what it means to live a meaningful life. We changed autism from something enigmatic and frightening into something that we understand. And with the help of Asperger's, for example, which served us well and which we really needed until recently, autism became a much less stigmatized phenomenon. And I saw this kind of transformation in a matter of minutes when Isabel, my daughter, now 30, graduated from high school. Not only did her teachers not expect her to graduate from high school, but she was the first student with a disability to give a graduation speech. And when she got up and spoke to the high school class and their families, and there were about 3,000 people there. This is at Daughters of the American Revolution Hall, right near the White House. You could hear people in the audience who didn't know her. Most people didn't know her. She was in small, more self-contained classes throughout her high school. And the parents didn't necessarily know her. And you could hear murmurs, you could hear whispers. Those are the sounds of stigma, right? There were some kids laughing. Why? Because she spoke in a way that was unusual and she used words that were unusual. Her syntax and intonation is distinctive. But then she got to a point in her graduation speech where she said, people with autism like me, and everything's just quieted down. I mean, it still gives me chills to think about what a moment that was. It was just a matter of seconds, saying that she had autism, advocating for herself, defining herself as she wanted to be defined, taking ownership of this term rather than it being used to demean her or marginalize her, gave people a framework to understand her. And so she shifted from being somebody that was enigmatic or strange to somebody who was a person with autism, who wasn't ashamed of having autism, and who then in the content spoke about her strengths and all the things that she does and modeled herself, or an attempt to model herself after Temple Grandin, the famous veterinarian, writer, animal care specialist, who is also an autistic self-advocate. And we're seeing this kind of thing happening throughout undergraduate education, for sure. We have instances in which a student stands up, like in my class of 292 students in intro, and says to the class on the first day that they have Tourette's disorder and want people to understand that they have Tourette's so that they have a framework for understanding how they speak, what they might blurt out, what might surprise people. Again, moving from the enigmatic and marginalized and demeaned to something which is a framework that people understand now and respect. I tell the story in Nobody's Normal also of a student who said that the best day of her freshman year was when she got a diagnosis for ADHD. She had, throughout high school, told her parents that she felt she needed to get some kind of diagnosis for something that she was having trouble learning. And her parents thought she was lazy, and they thought that she wasn't working hard enough, and they thought maybe she just wasn't that smart. And what she said to a class, and we have to understand just how radical a move this is, at least for someone who's been in education for some decades, for students to sort of openly talk about with other students their disabilities, mental illnesses, other issues that they might have that might require treatment or accommodation. And she said, for the first time, once she was diagnosed, she said, somebody saw me as needing help rather than as somebody who was lazy or stupid, and that she had begun to see herself that way. She had begun to internalize her parents' message, thinking that she perhaps was lazy or she perhaps was not intelligent. And so, she was then stigmatizing herself. Well, the question that I ask in this book is, if there are indeed advances in reducing stigma, increasing access to care, and emboldening advocates, can we identify the variables that account for it? How did it happen? If we can't identify the variables that account for it, how can we reinforce them? How can we stay the course? Well, it turns out if you look at the literature, we know less about the historical contexts in which stigma emerges. We know less about the social economic context that disability studies at Fordham studies, fortunately, than we do about the phenomenology, the experience of individuals with stigma. I mean, the famous work of Erving Goffman is noticeably ahistorical, looking at kind of the micropolitics or microsociology of how people experience difference, rather than looking at how those experiences were shaped by a complex and total context. So I often ask my students, here you are talking openly about disabilities. How'd that happen? Why is stigma diminished? And my students may say, as they often do, well, we now value diversity, including neurodiversity, more than sameness. We don't value this old concept of normality anymore. But when I ask them why they don't value that concept of normality or why they value diversity, they answer, because there's less stigma. And it's this circular reasoning, which points to the fact that we still have to work at explaining the changes we're witnessing. And this is why the work that Dr. Crystal described about looking at the social, historical, and cultural contexts of disability is just so urgent and important. The researchers, like Erving Goffman and others, are compassionate. They've devoted their careers to studying stigma, but they've focused more on the present. They have focused on how labels and stereotypes alienate sufferers, how people with mental illnesses lose status and are discriminated against, how they manage their differences or even hide them. What we know less about, again, is why particular kinds of stigma emerge or what forms of power sustain them. And I have been writing that I think the answers to those questions are unlikely to be found in the basic sciences. That we cannot, probably never will, see mental illnesses in a microscope or test for them in a laboratory. They're shaped by more experiences than we can imagine: genes, childhood, wealth, poverty, friendships, education, and so on. So I spend a considerable amount of time in my writing looking at the history of mental illness, psychiatry, and developmental disorders to locate the processes responsible for the ebb and flow of stigma in history. And a couple of things are clear to me. One is that education and awareness, public service announcements, and so on, have had a limited effect on the reduction of stigma. Stigma is not caused primarily by a lack of education or ignorance. Another thing I found is that medical and scientific advances have not lessened the stigma of mental illness. So it's not education or awareness, nor is it medical and scientific advances. Why? Because our judgments about mental illnesses come from our definitions of what, at different times and places, people consider the ideal society, the ideal person. Stigma, abnormality, difference, these are related to any society's notion of what they value the most or do not value. So stigma ebbs and flows as the result of very deep structural conditions, in particular capitalism, ideologies of individualism and personal responsibility, and even the complicated legacies of war, racism, and colonialism. We can think about neurodiversity and how it grew in tandem with changing economic conditions. That's not a surprise. Advocates for neurodiversity modeled the movement explicitly after the social model of disability. The social model of disability is the idea that it is the environment in which one lives. It is not the individual that is responsible for disability. In this view, a person who's blind, for example, is only disabled when there are sidewalk obstacles and an absence of tactile and auditory aids. Similarly, the disability of a person who's unable to speak or is highly socially awkward is a disability only when there is no other form of communication. But we are mitigating that disability with digital communication, email, telecommuting, the actual technology we're using right now. And economies now rely heavily on information services, such as the collection, analysis, and manipulation of data for marketing. They rely less on social skills and face-to-face interaction. We have a move from manufacturing goods in factories toward flexible production. All of these things have opened up a degree of community integration that was formerly inaccessible for people with mental illnesses and disabilities in general. And we cannot reduce this change to one or another variables, such as better awareness or better education. The people who have stigmatized people with mental illnesses and other disabilities for decades and decades were very educated people too, including the health professionals who claimed to be in support of them. So again, it's not education, it's not awareness so much as it is these sort of larger, deep structural contexts in which we live. And this is why in my newest work, Nobody's Normal, I start with early capitalism. Not to say that capitalism caused stigma, but that capitalism provided the conditions to create the particular type of stigma that we have employed for centuries against those who society deemed to be not only different, but abnormal or undesirable. Capitalism isn't just a form of economics. Capitalism is also a way of thinking. And it is also a way of conceiving of the relationship between the individual and society. And those of you who have read de Tocqueville will know that in his classic account of democracy in America, he made the case that in the United States, the individual was everything. The autonomous individual, independent, master to no one except a master to subservient to no one except perhaps God, was the ideal American. And again, capitalism didn't create mental illnesses, but it created the conditions for them to be described, and it created the conditions for the building of prisons, asylums, places in which mostly well-meaning scientists began to divide up the world into the normal and the abnormal. The first asylums in Western Europe aimed to house the idle. The mandate of these asylums was to take care of people who did not work, who did not produce, who did not therefore conform to the ideals of individualism and autonomy so central to capitalism. And alongside the growth of capitalism was the ongoing Enlightenment effort among European scientists to understand what separated humans from other animals. Not only were humans ideally independent, autonomous beings, but they were also beings that were sentient and had reason and rationality. So the first form of stigma that we see for people with disabilities is through the use of animal metaphors. Humans, unlike animals, had reason, right? So as early as 1609, we find these lines in Hamlet where Shakespeare says in the context of Ophelia's madness that humans without reason may not even be humans at all. Act 4, Scene 5, Hamlet says, divided from herself and her fair judgment, without the which we are pictures or mere beasts. In fact, if you look at the records of early asylums, like late 1700s, early 1800s, asylum workers are often describing the residents as beasts, people capable of incredible physical strength, people who are impervious to intense heat or cold or pain. They are animals that have to be tamed and controlled. Similarly, physical deformity also suggested a predisposition to animality and mental disease, and therefore control of the body was crucial to the control of social deviance, and control of the body included asylums. restraints, imprisonment, separation from society. Now, even when René Descartes argued that one's mind is distinct from one's body, European scientists persisted in linking control of the body to social ideals. Why? Because the separation of body and mind could be used to reinforce hierarchy. So remember, scientists are saying that the ideal human is both individual and autonomous and has reason. Well, scientists reasoned that if the mind and the body of the human were separate, then perhaps the elites were driven by their minds, while the uneducated peasants laboring in the fields or in the factories were driven like animals by instinct and appetite. Their bodies needed to be controlled, which is one reason why there was so much capital punishment in England. I mean, during the 18th century, there were 150 different crimes for which a person could be executed. Discipline for behavioral problems was administered against the body, not the mind. The countless people who were hanged or beheaded in England were often referred to actually as dead commodities. In the words of historian Peter Linebaugh, quote, "the casualties of both capital punishment and the punishment of capital," unquote. Witch hunts were another form of bodily control, though directed specifically at poor women. And in this transition to capitalism, there was an intensified patriarchal order aimed at maximizing wealth, which included the number of children one had. Confident that population growth was the key to personal and national wealth, men were afraid of anything that interfered with reproduction and their control over women's bodies. And a lot of that hasn't changed actually in centuries. Women were considered at best morally inferior to men, and at worst conspirators plotting to undermine economic progress. In England, in France, also notably in Spain, historian Silvia Federici writes, men suspected that women were preventing pregnancies, killing infants, making sexual pacts with the devil, and the lower a woman's status, the more likely she was to be ruled by her body rather than her mind, like an animal without reason. And so the transition to capitalism was, in a phrase, an attack on the body, which is why we see all of these asylums growing. At one point, it's estimated that 1% of the population of Paris was in an asylum. For the first time, scientists had enough people in one place to be able to divide them up and classify them and say, these are beggars, these are substance abusers, these are the insane, these are the feeble-minded, and so on. Of course, if we go back to women, and women were the majority of residents in most asylums, scientists also argued that women not only were more like animals, but they were more closely connected to nature than men. That their bodies were naturally designed by nature rather than culture, nature to function for the reproduction and feeding of babies. Even menstruation paralleled the movement of the moon. Women, scientists argued, were also governed more, again, by their bodies, so they were more susceptible than men to their impulses, their instinct and appetite, and therefore more susceptible to insanity. Men, in contrast, were designed to control nature, including women. And of course, it wouldn't be long before the process of harnessing women's bodies for capitalism changed even the language of medicine. Doctors would call childbirth a process of labor and delivery. Menstruation, they would call failed production. And menopause would be described in obstetrics textbooks as factories in decline. The ovaries like a factory in decline. So let me go back to what I said about scientists beginning to view all of these people and observe them in settings where they'd never had so many people before. Why were they there? Not because the police or the government gathered them into these British or French asylums. They were brought there by families because they were unproductive. It was the families that brought their disabled relatives, for whatever the disability, to remove them so they were not a drain on the economy. And this is where scientists could generate the concept of mental illness, separate diseases of the body from diseases of the mind, and attempt to establish new branches of medicine like psychiatry. So psychiatry begins as basically asylum management. We're not talking about mental health care for somebody who's depressed. We're talking about people who are considered to be unable to live in society. And this is one reason why psychiatry itself as a profession was stigmatized. As you know, the psychiatrists in the 1800s throughout Europe were considered little more than asylum managers, which is why most of the early psychiatrists were Jewish, because psychiatry was the lowest status, or one of the lowest status professions, the other being dermatology, which was occupied mostly by treating syphilitic sores. And so Jews were relegated to those two professions as they were discriminated against: psychiatry to manage asylums, dermatology to take care of sores. And in fact, in Austria, the name for dermatology was, or the slang term for dermatology was Judenhaut, Jew's skin. But what did these psychiatrists do? They didn't just manage asylums. They actually created a discipline that was focused on observing the bodies, not the mind so much as the bodies and the behavior. That included sex, masturbation, the shape of the skull, whatever it was that was physical, because they were all linked to the functioning of the mind. And sex was a special curiosity because so many doctors believed that the sex organs held the key to understanding and treating mental illnesses. Masturbation, especially because it was not a social behavior, was also considered aberrant. Writing in 1854, a French physician named T. Parvin did not think he was exaggerating when he said, and I'll quote here, quote, "Neither the plague, nor war, nor smallpox, nor a crowd of similar evils have resulted more disastrously for humanity than the habit of masturbation," unquote. Scientists were also keen to understand women's sexuality because they believed that women were, as I said, more prone to insanity than men. The French philosopher Pierre Jean-Georges Cabanis was certain that unmarried women were especially at risk for dementia and idiocy. Marriage was, in his view, like an asylum that protected women from disease. And as a consequence of a lot of this thinking, we have the work of Sigmund Freud, the work of his friend and colleague Wilhelm Fliess to alter the mucous membranes, particularly through operations on the nose, which were said to relate to the genitals and therefore would alter any kind of disturbances in thought and behavior. Freud himself had his own nose operated on. And we also have the development of strategies to prevent aberrant or abnormal behaviors. And among those are the development of the graham cracker by Sylvester Graham, who invented a bland cracker that he thought would counter the spicy, more flavorful diets that created sexual impulses and impulsivity. And we have the work of the Kellogg brothers, who produced a concoction of bland, at that time unsweetened, rolled oats and dried grains, which they called granula. It was already copyrighted, that name, so they had to change it. It became granola. So the history of the graham cracker, the history of granola is intimately tied to efforts to prevent masturbation and other kinds of sexual impulses. During the 19th century, debates about the confinement of the mentally ill intersected with debates about another kind of confinement, not just asylums. It intersected with debates about slavery. pro-slavery advocates from a range of professions argued strongly against emancipation and looked for scientific data to support their views. Just as women needed to be in asylums, they believed, to prevent insanity, slaves needed to be owned. They had to remain in slavery because they would otherwise lose their minds. They would be unable to operate or live in society without physical constraints on their impulses and instincts. In other words, slavery provided a structure to prevent a loss of control, and psychiatrists even developed a term, drapetomania, the symptoms of which were the desire to be free of slavery. I mean, if that doesn't tell you how our notions of mental illness are tied to structural inequalities, nothing does. So that kind of history, showing how capitalism creates the conditions for the way in which we define difference, constitutes a big part of my work. But I also include in my work attention to another kind of history, and it's the history of American and European wars. The role of wars in changing the way we think about the mind, mental illness, disability, is a relatively untold story. Yet wars illuminate many illnesses and disabilities, like the asylums in which the very idea of mental illnesses we know emerged. Wars provided the context in which psychiatry and psychology emerged as bona fide disciplines. Indeed, the history of the mental health professions shouldn't be characterized by the slow incremental growth of knowledge, but rather by bursts of knowledge that were generated during wars, as well as sustained periods of forgetting between wars, in which clinicians and researchers remained ignorant of the lessons learned in previous conflicts. And there's a lesson here for us in COVID, which most political leaders have referred to as a war, which is that it has, in a sense, globalized or generalized to all of us the kind of naturalness of stress and or emotional distress. If you said to somebody before the pandemic, if you say to somebody in the pandemic that you're really stressed out, lonely, isolated, whatever, because of the pandemic, people are much less likely to see you as fragile or weak or having some kind of defective character. They're much more likely to say, yeah, me too. The pandemic's been hard. Well, wars did that too. Wars, while asylums exacerbated shame, wars reduced it. And this was both in military and civilian life. In wartime, psychiatric disturbances became acceptable responses to stress. And so military psychiatry serves as a kind of microcosm through which we can see in sometimes exaggerated form broad trends in the diagnosis, treatment, and moral judgments of mental illnesses. In World War II, my grandfather ran psychiatric operations in North Africa for a little more than a year. And it was in North Africa that my grandfather realized for the first time just how common mental illnesses were in American society, how stressors outside of one's body can cause or exacerbate emotional problems. And more importantly, that mental illnesses were treatable outside of asylums and hospitals. This is what wars did. They moved psychiatry out of the asylum into the general population. In fact, as a direct response to the war, President Harry Truman establishes the National Institute of Mental Health and orders the military to write a manual for the diagnosis of mental disorders to ensure that there was some degree of standardization among clinicians and researchers, because World War II saw an unprecedented expansion of the number and range of people who suffered from what were called mental disorders. And that manual that he ordered the military to write, that was the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders 1. It was the first DSM. It was written by the military during World War II. It was called Medical 203, and then adapted by the military in 1953 for civilian use. And that's where we get the first DSM. Unfortunately, by the 70s, during the anti-Vietnam War movement within the psychiatric establishment, that military history was largely lost, at least for a bit of time. Many argued that military psychiatry had no relationship to psychiatry. And so what they had forgotten, or maybe they never knew, those who wanted to disregard what had come from military psychiatry, is that their own ideas and practices came from the military. The therapeutic community, group therapy, psychiatric screening as a preventive measure, the treatment of acute stress reactions, short-term psychotherapy, community psychiatry, and most of all, psychological testing. Arguably the field of psychology owes its tremendous growth in the last 50, 60, 70 years to what happened during World War II in the attempt to screen out people with mental illnesses from the military. I don't want to belabor the point and talk too much about the military, both for the purposes of time and also because I can get down into a rabbit hole of tremendous detail. But if I'm trying to make the point that the larger context has to be looked at in relationship to how something is defined or stigmatized, we need only look at World War I for a great example of this. In World War I, at the beginning, there were 50 psychiatrists in the US military. They weren't really psychiatrists. They were mostly orthopedists, obstetricians who were kind of drawn in to work on people with distress. And how did people describe their symptoms during World War I? When they were having emotional distress, they didn't say they were anxious or depressed. They had an awkward gait, or they were dizzy, or they couldn't see, or they couldn't speak, or they had paralysis. And these are people who were nowhere near combat, most of them. And so the patients invented a new term called shell shock as a way to understand their symptoms biologically, to talk about them in a way that was not psychological or emotional in nature. And the term took off. And by May 1917, 15% of British soldiers had been discharged from the military with the diagnosis of shell shock, most of them having never been near a battle. Why did they go to shell shock as their preferred diagnosis? Because the only other possibility was hysteria. And hysteria, linked to the term for uterus in ancient Greek and modern Greek too, was a feminizing diagnosis. It led to immediate discharge from the war. It led to stigma, marginalization, and a kind of feminization from which many people really suffered a great deal. But here again, as an example of how inequality comes into play, the diagnosis and psychiatric symptoms varied in World War I according to social status and military rank. So if you were an enlisted man, you probably experienced the gross bodily symptoms like paralysis, mutism, deafness, awkward gait. And many officers had the same symptoms, but the higher the rank, the more likely they were to describe their distress in emotional terms or with symptoms like fatigue and insomnia. Fatigue and insomnia were associated with mental disturbances among elites, particularly scholars and scientists. And in England, the class system often eclipsed compassion. So British doctors preferentially applied the category of shell shock to people who were elites, and they used words like malingering and hysteria still, instead of shell shock, to characterize psychiatric symptoms in already marginalized populations, like working class soldiers, Jews, the Irish, and colonial subjects like West Africans. Class also influenced the way shell shock was described in Germany and France. Hysteria was more frequently used as a diagnosis for working class soldiers. In World War II, there was a dramatic change. By World War II, psychoanalysis was just starting to take hold. And people were starting in Europe, and especially in the United States, to talk about their feelings more. And even more than the concept of shell shock, psychoanalysis promised to bring psychiatry out of the asylum and into the general population, because psychoanalysis was, to some extent, a way to say, well, we are all ill. Nobody is normal. We are all neurotic. And what's fascinating is that the symptoms of trauma in the military change. In World War I, you've got people with that paralysis and awkward gait, and they almost entirely disappear in World War II to have different symptoms such as anxiety and depression. So the story of any sickness, of course, is one that doctors and patients weave together, where they find consensus about what constitutes a culturally legitimate and sensible symptom at a particular moment in history. Because of hysteria and its feminizing character, symptoms have one expression in World War I. The growth of psychoanalysis, normalizing emotional stress, then leads to new symptoms in World War II. And by the end of World War II, the New York Times suggested quite prematurely that my grandfather had eliminated the shame of mental illness in the military. He had said that the people who experienced enormous stress and psychiatric symptoms were not abnormal people. He said these are normal people in abnormal circumstances. The third part of my works, the first part is the history of capitalism, the second, the way in which wars shape the way in which we think about mental illnesses, positively and or negatively. And the third is the concept of normal, where I argue that the concept of normal is a damaging illusion that does very little to help anybody. Of course, the word normal, we sometimes think of it as a very old term, but it's only in the past 50, 60 years that the word changed to mean something that we aspire to or that we want. Prior to mid-20th century, the word normal was a mathematical term. It meant average, even mediocre. And where used, and where it was used differently, it was usually used mostly by scientists. It wasn't like the most colloquial term in the world. Alfred Kinsey, in his famous studies on sex and sexuality, tried very hard to impress his own perspective, cautioning readers consistently against using words like normal and abnormal loosely in everyday language. He said we could maybe think of them as ideal types, poles on a continuum, but they didn't belong in science, and nobody should really talk about normality and abnormality. But by writing so much about the normal, his argument backfired. These intellectual historians from Australia who've written an outstanding book on the history of normality, Peter Kreil and Elizabeth Stevens, writes that Kinsey's works were one of the main avenues by which normal moved into widespread circulation. The word became more popular than ever, changed from meaning average to something that everybody wanted, whether that was to have the absence of symptoms or to be the normal American with one car, two kids, and a white picket fence. One reason Kinsey's critique failed to stop normal from becoming a household word was that his argument was based on statistics rather than sentiment. Sometimes the statistically normal fits the social expectations of what is normal, but sometimes, as with homoerotic activities, the two diverge. So he shows that, in fact, it is a normal part of human development for people to experiment or to have some kind of homosexual behavior at some point, once or twice, for almost all people. And yet, even if you show something is statistically normal, like homosexual sex, what ends up being more important is what people believe is normal. And so Kreil and Stevens write, quote, even the best and most heroic critiques of the normal don't bring that concept crumbling down. My grandfather tried. He and my father did a study in a small town just outside of Chicago at a school for men. It was a college for men. It no longer exists, called the George Williams College. And typically what mental health professionals did, if they were going to look at a particular population, is that they would look at that population, find out who did not qualify for any mental illnesses, and then remove them and study the ones with mental illnesses. Well, my grandfather and father decided in 1961, why not do this the opposite way? Let's screen out all the people who qualify or meet the criteria for a mental illness, and let's look at the quote unquote normal. What did they look like? Well, he found that the ones who were quote unquote normal were who he called homocletes. It was a made-up word. That they were boring, in a word. They lacked creativity. They lacked ambition. They were not stellar students. They were not interesting people, in other words. And he wrote in the Archives of General Psychiatry, and it's a remarkable thing to say in 1961, so many decades before neurodiversity. He wrote, and I'm going to quote, is he writing about the normal people, right? He writes, quote, are the compulsive character and rigidity, the sharply focused and limited interests, the use of activity to maintain comfort, the absence of creativity, fantasies, and introspection, are these the costs we have to pay for stability and mental health? It was such an unusual thing to say. So I'm sorry, unquote. It was such an unusual thing to say that in the next sentence, he felt the need to tell his readers that it was not a joke. This is many decades before my students began wearing t-shirts that said, I hate normal people. What my grandfather and my father were suggesting was that normality was crippling, that some degree of mental illness, some degree of mental difference might be necessary for humanity to remain vibrant, creative, and diverse. But what we have seen since that time, since the 1960s, has been a lot of change, but still persistence in trying to think of our differences more in biological terms than in the kind of cultural, social, economic, larger scale that I've been talking about. And we see some of this resistance in the stigma associated with mental illnesses that persists, where people who do have symptoms that may have a psychiatric component often reject the medicalization, they reject the psychiatric conception of their symptoms in the search for some kind of underlying biological phenomenon that will give their illness more credence or status or acceptability than a mental illness. About a third of all patient visits to neurologists in the United States, this includes people with numbness, vision, speech impairments, seizures, paralysis. About a third of all patient visits have no scientific or medical finding other than the symptoms themselves. So no measurable or observable data, no discernible cause for the symptoms. Doctors give some of these patients a diagnosis of, quote, functional neurologic symptom disorder. Yet clinicians are reluctant to tell patients what this actually means. It's the modern term for conversion disorder, which was once the modern term for psychosomatic disorders, which was once the modern term for hysteria. They know that many patients will react to that diagnosis as if they're being accused of fabricating the symptoms, as if their sicknesses aren't real. And here's the problem. Countless people suffer terribly from a range of physical conditions that could benefit from treatment with within the psychological professions, but they collude, patients and doctors collude to separate the body from the mind, to see diseases of the body as different from those of the mind, the diseases of the body as real, the diseases of the mind as somehow fictive, even though that separation is the source of stigma and a barrier to mental health care. The reaction of many leaders in psychiatry to the ongoing stigma of mental illness is to argue that barriers to care will be reduced, stigma will be reduced when we recognize that a mental illness is biological, an illness like any other illness. And I'm very critical of this in the book. I argue that this kind of medicalization of human suffering is one that is not that far off from the stigmata of phrenology, in which there was an attempt to separate behavior from the contexts in which we live and to isolate them within the individual and the individual human mind. I do not want to go on too long because I would love for there to be time for question and answer, but I do want to say that in this turn to the brain, in the decade of the brain, in the move to conceptualize mental illnesses in neuroscientific and biological terms, we lose sight of the social model of disability. We lose sight of the fact that medical disorders, mental illnesses, all forms of difference are shaped by so many factors that we cannot think of our emotions and our behaviors, our skills and our weaknesses. We cannot reduce those to a person's brain and forget the person's social context. And we know that medical disorders experience this as well. It's not the broken brain. You break your leg, you go get your leg fixed. The mind, behavior is a much more complicated thing. We know that mental illnesses are biological. Everything is biological, but it is also something that has to be situated within culture and in history. I think we're on the right track. And I think that the fact that we're starting to use words like autism, bipolar, depressed, anxious, whatever it might be, PTSD more colloquially, is a sign that we are embracing a view that to be not normal is actually to be human, that to be different is to be human, that to depend on others is to be human, that to live in interdependent relationships rather than as autonomous individual producers is what makes us human. It is impossible to end stigma completely. Every society can find something to demean and marginalize. Every society has a mechanism through which people are demeaned and marginalized. In the history of Western civilization, capitalism is that particular form of or process of stigmatization, wherein, as in many other societies, like those I've lived in Southern Africa, Central and Southern Africa, there are other methods to stigmatize and marginalize. We may not be able to end it completely, but we can still resist stigma. We can name it, we can mute it, we can shape it, we can understand that it is not inevitable, that it is in culture, not nature. And if we can shape it, if we can change it, that ought to be empowering. And we only need to look at the kinds of examples that I gave you earlier, whether it's my daughter Isabel or my students, to give us hope. And I'll end there, and I'm happy to take any questions, or even if you don't have a question, a comment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Grinker. What an incredible talk. Really appreciate this.